10. 10 being GitLab, which is a very large, very complicated open source Rails project, and 1 being the 5-minute or 15-minute blog from the original Rails video, right? And so we say, okay, most Rails apps fall somewhere in between those two. I have yet to see an 11 on that scale. I'm sure that app is out there somewhere, and I'm sure it's probably running Rails 2.4 somewhere, right? So we know that that's a thing that could happen, but we try and look at the different possibilities. And then from there we develop a plan, and I wanted to show you kind of what one of these plans looked like. So this is a plan from an actual project that's been essentially scrubbed out to be a sample. So it starts with a summary of findings. We talk about like where the application's at. We definitely, so at Notch8 we believe in trying to be compassionate about the way that we talk about each other's code and try and fight this sort of culture of, well, that's shit, clearly. And try and like rise above that, especially when it comes to things like design and when it comes to things like code complexity and that kind of thing. Like trying to find more supportive ways to talk about it. But we do try and be really candid, right? We want to be clear with you. Hey, the test coverage on this is all very much like A equals B, and then the test says, well, A will equal B, and that's it. There's no depth there. There's no error checking. There's no, well, what happens if somebody puts in a 5 instead of an A, right? And so we go through, we look at all of these metrics, and we try and come up with some sort of summary, and that summary sort of drives the plan. Again, we document the Rails versions, the Ruby versions. We run a gem report, and we're going to learn how to do these gem reports using a tool called Bundler Audit. And then we dig into the ones that need to be changed, right? So for example, for this app, it was using this thing it was using a GitHub repository from GiraffeSoft called Resource Controller. So it was a fork of Resource Controller that was maintained by somebody who had deleted their GitHub repo for it. Like that code was gone. And so we actually ended up going onto the server and accessing it that way in order to get the app up and running. And sort of like harvesting it from the live production server because we had no idea what it was said, right? Like what was in that code. And we made the decision for this app that we should completely replace it. Resource Controller is sort of the predecessor to the kind of REST-based controllers that are native to Rails and Hyrax now. And so this app originally, I believe, was Rails 2.4.3, right? So it was really behind. And when I say really behind, we did this upgrade audit last year, right? So 5 to 10 years in the rearview mirror here. We talked about upgrading CanCan. We try really hard not to replace things if we can avoid it. We want to do the minimum work we can here to get up to date. But for example, Paperclip, we know that when you go from Paperclip like 1 or 2 to Paperclip 5, 1, that's a very big jump. And 2, they've reconfigured everything. And so it's much easier to actually completely uninstall Paperclip, reinstall Paperclip, and re-import the files. Right? There's a couple of command line tools that you can use to rearrange where they sit in the file system, or you can configure Paperclip 5 to look at the old place for files, but then trying to upgrade the configuration doesn't work well. Okay? This app was using RSpec2 syntax. We upgraded it all the way across the board to RSpec3. Test coverage for this app was in the 70s, but when you looked at the tests that were there, they were awesome, right? Like just really quality tests. People not just checking the positive path, people checking error states. They did have 7 different mocking libraries that they were using in their specs. It was clearly an example of someone looking at all of the available mocking libraries in like 2009 and saying, yeah, we'll just use all of them. There were Mochas and there were RSpec mocks, and I just like so many testing frameworks. And we did simplify that because 3 of the ones they were using no longer really exist. This is kind of what the app size comparison looks like. We look at classes, lines of code, give it a relative size. On our scale, Spree is a 9, GitLab is where our 10 is, and you can see that this one came in kind of right in the middle, which I find is by far the most common, right? That there's some code complexity. We've had to adjust this scale significantly to do hierarchs, because so much of the Sophia or hierarchs code doesn't live in your app. It lives in Sophia, or curation concerns, or the gems that those pull in. Right? There's so much layering of engines, or blacklight, that it can be really deceptive. You can say, oh, well, this app's a 2, so it doesn't have very much code in it at all. But you look right under the surface, and there's this huge block of code that also has to be updated. And so that definitely adds to the complexity. Like, I don't think anyone would look at a running hierarchs 2.3 app and say, oh, that's a very simple Rails app. It's not. It's just not. So we've had to adjust our scale a little bit to try and account for some of that underlying stuff. But we look at a bunch of open source. This is an open source help monitor. The Learn application, Learn Academy, is a code school that I'm also a founder of. So I get access to their code because I'm the guy who writes it. And so we have that in here. Cool. And then we lay out the details. And so this particular plan, what we ended up saying is, it's a big leap from Rails 2.4 to Rails 5.1, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to create a scratch Rails 5.1 app, and then we're going to bring all the gems over and get the libraries sort of situated and get to a place where we can bundle successfully with all the dependencies we think we're going to need. Then we're going to bring the models over and the model specs in one go, just the specs for the models and the models, and get those to all pass. Right? And step 1 of that, sub-step 1 of that is get the specs to run, right? So that they all fail. And then bring the model code over, get the specs to all pass. Then we did the same with the controllers. And when you bring the controllers over, you have to bring typically the controllers, the views, and the routes all as one package. Since no matter how solidly people try to decouple those specs, they generally end up pretty coupled. And I personally advise doing only the barest unit level controller specs and doing integration specs. I don't typically write individual view specs for my apps. And I'm not alone there. Yehuda Katz also recommends that. There are a couple other prominent folks in the Rails community that recommend it. DHH does not weigh in on that particular topic because he doesn't write tests most of the time. Dirty little secret of the Rails community. So fundamentally, you bring that sort of whole unit over. And we did this all while turning on the old Rails security model. So we are still using protected attributes instead of strong params. And do you guys know kind of what strong params is? Familiar with that? So essentially, Rails, all the way up to Rails 3.2, the security for which parameters you could change in a model by just submitting a form was all in the model itself. So in your user model, you would specify that I can change the name and the email from a web form, but I can't change the admin flag unless I do that explicitly. I have to say user.admin equals true. I can't just have a form submit that does that. And that came about as a defense mechanism because there was a period of time where on the GitHub user edit page, you could open up the Firefox DevTools and you could add a form field that said is admin, and you could set it to true, and you could then click save on the form, and you would then be the GitHub admin. That's a problem, right? And so we had this protected attributes in the models, and what they realized is that you have admin views and you have different views of different data, and that you should be checking which things are allowed in a given form at the controller level and not at the model level. So that whole concept of where that security lives got moved from in the models to the controllers. But what that means when you're upgrading is that you need to go to every single controller action and specify which parameters are allowed to be accepted by that controller action. So it can be quite a bit of work, mostly because you have to go to the view, figure out what fields are being present, what's being submitted, and then map that into the controller. So we did this whole upgrade without that and said, okay, that'll be an after step. This app made extensive use of a thing called RJS, which was an early method for having JavaScript in your Rails application. And the decision was made, they had about half RJS and half jQuery. And so the decision was made to move it all to jQuery. And we talked about the possibility of moving it to like the Rails 5.2, 5.1 asset pipeline, which uses like JS for its building and Yarn and some more modern tools. But the developers on this team basically said, yeah, we don't do React and we don't do Angular and we don't want to talk about it. Like, let's just make it all jQuery. We're comfortable there. We're just going to let the dust settle on that whole thing. We'll come back to it another time. And it totally made sense to us, so we just kind of brought everything in. They also had 3 versions of jQuery that were running on various pages. And one of the things about jQuery that's fundamentally true is if you load jQuery once, you're good. If you load jQuery twice, nothing works right. And so we like cleaned all of that up as its own separate step. And you can see here that in our proposal we marked that as optional, right? They didn't have to do that. They could have linked along with their old JavaScript if they wanted to. And then finally, the last step was upgrading strong params as its own separate step. So we had an application that worked and could be shipped essentially after step 4 here. And then step 5 and 6 were sort of, well, let's get everything else where it needs to be before we move on again. This particular, like the underlying application that this sample came from is used by water meters in streams and rivers throughout America to report data into a dashboard. So folks that are interested in water table research and that kind of thing, like, so it definitely, like, the sensors have a 20-year lifespan, so they get deployed and don't get updates for like 20 years. And then of course every 4 or 5 years they have to come along and upgrade their Rails app to like now support whatever the current sensors are. Anybody have any questions on that? Right, it's 3 levels down. Yeah.
And I don't know what consequences.
Essentially, what will happen for those is, especially if you're making, I mean, when you're talking about the move from the current active Fedora backend to the Valkyrie backend, that's going to be a big move, right? That's definitely, hey, let's swap the engine on this bus while driving it down the freeway in traffic kind of move. And so a lot's going to change. I don't think that anyone could tell you which dependencies will go away and which ones will be kept at this time, right? I know that there's a lot of effort to try and get there and try and get a view of what that looks like. I have also heard from several people that there will be clear provided upgrade paths, which I do not believe at all. I'm sorry, I just don't. I have no faith in that as a software developer. Everyone always tells you that they're going to build the upgrade path as part of the 1.0 release. And then as you near the 1.0 release, they say, oh, it's going to come in 1.1. That's when we're going to do the upgrade path, and then it never happens, right? And so I would guess that for like your ECMAScript overrides, in my mind, that as long as they're like fundamentally atomic, like you talked about, it saving work, right, being something that you've overridden the process of, that you want to clearly document what the goal of that override is when you write the override, or at least while people are around that still remember. You know what I mean? Because coming back in and saying, okay, this code, like I have to shift my brain back 4 years or 5 years to figure out what this code does is really hard. But coming in and saying, oh, the goal of this save override was to change the message on the save, right? And then I can then say, okay, then if I re-implement that in the new system, then as long as I get the right message, that I have succeeded at replacing that code. Does that make sense? So the kind of code comments you leave in those overrides really matters. Sometimes that ship has sailed, and then you're back to reverse engineering. I'm a big fan of pulling up the old version and seeing what the override accomplished, right? Like what was the version at that time? Like what were we doing? And why did we override it? And once you do that detective work, then it's usually easier to decide, do I try and bring this forward as is, or do I rewrite it? Does that make sense? And especially in cases where the dependency goes away, right? Then you're looking at almost certainly re-implementing those particular parts.
Right, yeah,
Right.
this is what I wanted to make sure, so with that major version, nobody is gonna miss.
Yeah, again, like the underlying, so much of the underpinnings are changing, that you're gonna have a completely different gem stack, and that's gonna make a big impact, for sure. There's gonna be upgrade there. There isn't gonna just be, like you increment the gem version number and kind of upgrade there. That's realistic. However, I do think fundamentally that given the state of things now and the place where things are going, that upgrade paths are absolutely possible. Okay? I think that they're going to probably end up being custom. I don't think there's going to be a good one size fits all. In my mind, that idea makes a solid import and export in Hyrax the most important feature of 2018. Right? Well, at this point, probably 2019. But fundamentally, like that's the thing that we should all be fighting for, right? Because if we have some sort of incremental import and export process, then we can make bigger changes without having to go back to original sources, without losing any metadata, cleanup and additions, without all of those things, right? And so in my mind, that's probably a big piece of being healthy going forward, because we know the ground's changing underneath us. And like we know Fedora 5, even if we just stay where we are, Fedora 5's coming out with a significantly different API and different feature sets, right? So even just staying still isn't probably really tenable. Which I know the underlying original promise of Fedora is that you'd always be able to access your data and you'd never have to move on. But that's not, I don't think, realistic. I'm not sure it ever was. It feels mean to say that, but I think it's true. Okay, so let's talk about tools. These are the major tools that we use for our evaluating a Rails application. We can find Hyrax, non-Hyrax, doesn't matter. We use Brakeman. Brakeman is a pretty good security tool. It's going to tell you things like you're doing SQL injections, or you have an admin controller that you didn't protect with roles. It's kind of important. So it gives you a really nice set of like what best practices weren't followed at the time this app was built, and they keep the database up to date all the way back to I think Rails 2.3. So it's got a pretty extensive database. So that's one that we like to run a lot. This is really nice also to have the management discussion of why you think that this is the thing you need to be doing. Security vulnerabilities are a real thing, and especially on university campuses, you have this thing called bored college students that can get themselves into trouble if you leave things open. So I do think that can be very helpful, and it's definitely something to look at. Bundler Audit is going to tell you about the patch levels in your gem file. It'll tell you what stuff needs to be upgraded in order to keep current on security practices. And Bundle Audit will tell you which gems no longer exist. So if you're pulling in a lot of gems from GitHub, one of the drawbacks of that, one of the problems from it is that code can go away. Right? Somebody else can delete that code. Ruby gems, theoretically, that's also true, but it's very rare for people to delete a Ruby gem. Like once they published it to the rubygems.org site, we typically try and fork anything that we're going to use. And usually you'll see they have one commit, which is the commit to the README that's like why we forked this thing, right? Like so if I fork a gem from a branch of somebody's repository to get Rails 5.2 support, I want to note that the only reason I did that was to get Rails 5.2 support. And so if I come back in a year and Rails 6.1 support is now in the main line, I can say, okay, I'm going to abandon that. I don't care about that feature anymore, right? So some of this prep is easier if you do it ahead of time, right? Be kind to the future maintainers of your projects whenever possible. And the big thing about that is leaving the why you did things as artifacts. Not just the what, but the why. Retire.js is bundler audit for Node, like everything and other JavaScript packages. So it'll tell you if there are vulnerabilities in React, if you're pulling React in, or vulnerabilities in some jQuery library that you're using. Unfortunately, as is true of almost everything in the JavaScript world, there are about 15 contenders for this tool. Retire.js is currently the most comprehensive. That does not mean it is comprehensive, but it has the best database of the ones that are out there. You may find, if you do some research, that there's a better tool out there today. Since I didn't look this morning, I would never say that with confidence. Right? It's just the way JavaScript works as a community. And then the last thing is built into Rails. It's been built into Rails from the very beginning. Is Rails stats will give you, it's a little rate task that runs, and it'll give you like lines of code and number of controllers, number of tests, that kind of thing. Okay. Any questions about that stuff? All right. So this brings us to our first exercise. I want to try and get interactive as early as possible. By show of hands, who has the Docker image that I sent out up and running on their machine? Expecting less than half. Okay, that's totally okay. That's not super unusual. Do all of you have the instructions for doing that? No. Okay. Let's start with that. So we have two choices. We can either let the folks that have the image kind of go ahead and start on the exercise and maybe take the group that doesn't yet and do it together. Or we can take the group that doesn't yet and try and get them installed. Anybody have a preference one way or another?
We all stick together, maybe we'll learn something.
You want to all stick together? So we're going to just do it as a mob exercise?
Sure.
Is that better? Okay. You just don't want me to have a break.
No.
I hear you. That's fine. Can we see that? Is that okay screen size-wise? Glare-wise and all that jazz? Alright. So, just so that everybody can capture the link. If you go to gitlab.com/notch8/Samvera Connect 2018, here, you'll be able to see the README has the install instructions for the exercises for both this morning and this afternoon, if that's something that you want to work on. If you'd rather just watch, that's totally okay. There's no audience participation requirement for my talk. All right. My computer alias Docker Compose to DC because I don't use whatever ancient Unix command DC actually is, and because I got tired of typing Docker compose. Because their Docker commands are really long. So what I did here was I started the container running, and then I'm going to actually get into a shell in the running container. DC sec. And then I'm going to go to the right repository. So what I decided to do as I was looking around for apps to use for this upgrading talk was I decided to use the React sample app that we used during our demo or workshop from last year, right? So this is code that has been untouched since Samvera Connect 2007. Lost a decade there for a second. If only we're that simple. So the first thing I want to look at is what does the bundler audit look like for this? And if I just type bundler audit, and to set this image up, I did, I just gem installed Bundler Audit. You don't have to have it in your gem file, you can. Brakeman specifically asks not to be in your gem file because it pulls in a bunch of dependencies that sometimes conflict with Rails, and you don't want to try and work that mess out. And what I get here is this report that basically says, yeah, a lot of things have real vulnerabilities. Right? So here's a great example. It doesn't show up on the screen. Alright, well that is what it is. Of Ruby zip. And we see that there's a CVE advisory. The database doesn't know how critical it is, unfortunately. And sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. Typically, unknown means probably not that super important. Having said that, if your gem is an esoteric gem and one that's not being used by a lot of people, then the chances of it being unknown go up, right? But it does say it's pretty easy. Oh, okay, it does tell us what's going on. Directory traversal in Ruby zip, right? So from that we can probably infer that during our zip pipeline, you can get into the outside file system. That's fundamentally problematic. But only really problematic if we're letting users have some sort of interaction that gets them there, right? So if they're like uploading custom zip files and we're unzipping them, that seems like that would be an issue. Moving on up. Here we go. So this one with FFI is a high critical issue, but it only affects the Windows operating system. So if we're not running our application on a Windows server, that's probably not really high for us, right? So there's always an amount of interpretation that goes to these. And we find often we end up going to the CVEs and trying to read the long, super complicated instructions. I have to do that first thing in the morning. I can't do it late in the day because definitely it's too close to like legal language to me. It just becomes all blurry words that run together. This one's super important. It's marked as unknown, but this no-cogiri vulnerability allows cross-site scripting attacks to anything that parses HTML or XML, which is everything, right? Like Rails is parsing. So any place that if you have user input that has HTML or XML in it, this would be a major vulnerability. If you don't have user input with HTML in it, then it doesn't matter to you, fundamentally. Like there's no way for that to be exploited. Right? So each of these has to be kind of judged. The other important thing with bundler audit is that you almost always want to run it with -- update. And I didn't do that today because I didn't want to spend the bandwidth on it and make you guys wait while it goes. But that downloads to the latest database. And so you can really fool yourself with bundler audit by just running the version that's sitting on the server. Right? Oh, no vulnerabilities, everything's good. Because we didn't check a database that's been updated since the last time we did the security patches. We have a couple places where like we basically have alias bundler audit to bundler audit -- update. And I would argue that should be the default, right? Like you should have to say no update if you want it to not update every time. But that pull request is not accepted. Okay, so let's look at break. Okay, let's scroll up here. So starting at the top, we see that Brakeman figured out we had a Rails 5 application. There are a few cases where it won't figure out what kind of Rails app you have and you have to tell it. But I haven't seen one recently. They're pretty good at it. It's for checking to make sure it's not wrong. And then it processes all of the files, and then it's running these various checks. It tells you all the checks that it's going to run. Looks for timing attacks, and cross-site scripting attacks, and mail-to attacks, DOS attacks. And this particular app has 4 controllers, 11 models, and 5 templates, and no errors. Awesome. Right? But here's the thing. it did not run against any of the Hyrax controllers that we're bringing in. That's a problem. There's so much code that we're bringing in from the outside here that we really need to go run that on the Hyrax gem itself and probably run it on Blacklight individually as well, because there's so much complexity in those two places. I don't feel like we have to go to every individual gem dependency and run it on those controllers, but I do think that that's something that you may want to do for those big chunks of code. Having said that, I think that like this is a place where Najee has tried to figure out how can we give back to the community a little more. I'd love to see like one person run those on a regular basis, right? Put them in the CI tool. You know, let's script it, make it easy, so that we can get that benefit to the community. You don't have to do it individually. Though when I put my security hat on, I'm probably still gonna check it myself, right? Like when I'm wearing my security hat, I try not to trust other people as much as possible, which is weird in the open source world because you're relying on a lot of other people no matter what you do. But so it's very much a like trust but verify sort of situation. And the last thing I'm going to show you oh nice. Brakeman seems to have messed up my terminal. Retire. Now retire, when you run it, does download the database every time. And the reason that retire.js comes into the equation here is this particular app has a package.json file with React dependencies in it because it has a Rails React app component. In fact, that was what we built as the point of that demo. If anyone was in my workshops last year, you'll remember we definitely did not get this far. Matt and I prepared what ended up being about 20 hours of material for our 4-hour workshop last year, so we did not get through all of it. Not surprising. Okay. So here we can see the same kind of report, jQuery, vulnerabilities, MAC address vulnerabilities. Here's a critical severity command injection vulnerability, right? Like we're gonna have to really convince ourselves that that's not exploitable before we don't, like that should be moved forward. Even if it doesn't seem like it's exploitable now, you never know when someone's gonna add some code later that then exploits it, makes it exploitable, makes it a public target. So we gather up all this information, we build our report. It's nice to be able to go to up the line or to whoever the client is and say, you know, this is what we figured out, this is why we figured it out. But at the end, the only way I know how to estimate things is to break them down into small parts and then guess, right? No one that I've ever met is great at estimating the big parts, but by small parts you can get moderately close and put some error bars on it. But I do want to be clear here that there is a subjective piece at the bottom of this, right? You make the whole report, and then you have to look at it and say, well, I think that there's 7 models, they're all really small, except for the one God model we have that has like 1,000 lines of codes in it. So that probably is going to take 3 or 4 days to move over, right? Like you got to get it down to that granular spot, but there is that subjective piece, and fundamentally, I don't think that can be eliminated. Because if nothing else, at some point you have to factor in the developers that are going to be working on the project. And no two developers are the same productivity-wise, and they certainly aren't the same day-to-day productivity-wise. Right? Like, so for example, me last August, I was just back from paternity leave. I didn't know what sleeping was like anymore. Probably not my most productive month. Right? So when we looked at my workload during that time, we had to estimate that based on the ROB that was available and not the quote-unquote optimal ROB that may or may not ever really exist. So I think that there's that last piece, and it's important to point out that there's that moment. We're an hour in. Do we want to take a 5-minute break? All right. let's talk about a little aside here. So we've talked a lot about the Rails and the Hierarchy or Hierarchs application itself. What about the underlying server? How many of you in your like day-to-day jobs maintain the infrastructure that you're actually working on? You do full DevOps responsibilities?
Well, we use virtual machines, but
Yeah, but you're in charge of keeping your VM up to date. Yeah, same. And it's sort of a mix, right? Like we get some of us have full IT departments that's their job, and some of us that are doing it solo. But I wanted to just talk really quickly about some of the tools we use on the server side when we're kind of keeping an eye on things. And these are by no means universal. There are some very expensive packages that you can buy that do some of this stuff, like I'm told really well. I've never worked in a place where we had that kind of budget, so I don't know. But these are the free open source tools that seem to do the job for us. OSSec, which monitors for change. So if the users file or your password file on your Linux machine changes, it's going to send you an email. If your like kernel version is updated, it's going to send you an email. If your hard drive fills up, it's going to send you an email before then not being able to send any more emails because now the hard drive's full, right? So it's just sort of this general like monitor, and mostly monitors for change. And then Linus, with a Y, is a tool that maintains sort of a vulnerability and attack vector rootkit detection database for Linux operating systems. So you can run that and see if you have any rootkits installed, if somebody has snuck a Bitcoin miner onto your system, those things, which is nice to know. And then I am a big fan of setting your package manager upgrades to some reasonable setting. And some reasonable setting depends on a lot of things, including your SLA, right? If 100,000 people are using your application and you have a mandated uptime of 4 or 5 nines, then doing the automated upgrade once a day is a bad idea. Because that does break every once in a while. They're pretty darn good with those security patches. But you're not going to be able to keep 5 nines if you're letting it happen automatically. And so you're scheduling that in a known window, for example, right? But for most of our projects where if it were down for 15 or 20 minutes while somebody fixed it, it wouldn't be a huge deal. I think that scheduling it for a time to run when you're going to be awake, and for me, I refuse to work if I'm not clothed. I get up and get dressed when the server goes down in the middle of the night. It's how I get my mental focus, right? So I try and do it when I'm for a time when I'm not wearing pajamas, basically. It's my goal for those upgrades, right? So it might be after hours, but in the evening, it's something I can plan around. But most the Red Hat systems have an automated security patch install that you can turn on. All Ubuntu and all the Debian systems have automated security patch installs. But I think instead of just saying turn it on, whatever you do, turn it on, I want to say turn it on, but be smart about how you turn it on. Okay. It's not super on topic for this talk, but I wanted to say, hey, there's these other tools. We have just a little quiz to see how everybody's feeling about what we've gone over so far, if you're interested in doing that. Again, there's no mandatory audience participation, but it's also not a very hard quiz, and I will not be grading it, so I just want to make that super clear to everybody that there's no grading. So we seem to have a really broad consensus in the 3 responses we've gotten on why we upgrade. Are there any other reasons we might do upgrades besides security patches?
Getting features and functionality.
Yeah, somebody's got to want some new features every once in a while. Bragging rights. Let's move on. So this is the second of our chronographically based topics. The first one is when do we upgrade? How often do we upgrade? This one is a part of how we upgrade. I'm going to talk about timing. As they say, is everything. But specifically with upgrades, timing can really depend on what's going on with the project, and you want to kind of be smart about this, right? So there are a couple of approaches to timing. So we're going to do an upgrade. We've made the decision that it's time. How do we do that? What does the timing look like for that? One approach is the halt the world upgrade, right? We say, okay, all active development stops. The whole team works on pushing the upgrade through, and then we resume active development. And this works great if it's a relatively small upgrade, right? Like if it's a 1 or 2 day task. It gives you the benefit of the whole team kind of coming together, maybe get a little spring cleaning in. Folks can maybe touch modules that they haven't touched before. I'm a big fan of trying to prevent silos as much as possible. It always scares me when I hear, oh, talk to George. George is in charge of the address book and no one touches the address book but George. Right? Like that's always a danger sign to me. Common, super common. And as developers, we're naturally possessive of our code. There's this tendency to be like, no, this is mine and it's perfect. Please don't touch it and or look at it. But I think that that's something that we have to fight as a culture, right? Constantly. Doesn't work super well if you have a lot of active development on a project, right? And it doesn't work really well if you have looming deadlines. So deadline sparseness is something that can be problematic here, right? You can't stop and do the big upgrade 3 weeks before launch on a major new feature set and expect to make your major new feature set launch, right? That's a recipe for disaster. So sometimes that works timing-wise. The other thing that really can be impact this is the size of the team, right? In a one-human shop, if there's one person actively developing the app, then Halt the World is really your only possible process. Unless you're capable of working on more than one code thing at a time, which even if you are, I advise against. And I'm totally. So then the next possible approach, timing-wise, is little pieces. So this is the idea that we're going to take and we're going to just get all of our model code up to date with current best practices, and then try and merge that in, and then possibly bring and go through and find all that old RJS code that we know needs to be translated into responsive jQuery and make that change. Or if we know that we're gonna bring in React stuff in the next version, starting those React components and getting them to kind of feature parity, a little piece at a time. And ultimately, you can nibble around the edges a lot in this approach, but there's probably still one of the other two approaches at the end, right? We'll either have to halt the world, or we'll have to do some phased approach at the end. But you can make a lot of progress this way, especially in the event where there's a lot of legacy code that's a dead end, right? You picked an awesome gem that you thought was going to save you a ton of time, and the maintainer not only has stopped maintaining it, but the person who took it over from them has stopped maintaining it, and they both left the planet Earth to move to the moon, right? And so that can be problematic. So you might know that there's some big code debt things that can be straightened up, and little pieces is a great approach for that. However, it can take forever to get to the actual this is upgraded part. And for me, I only have so much energy to clean my room in a given go, right? If I catch myself on the day when I'm I'm going to really make this room awesome today, I can get a lot of code cleanup done, but eventually that energy runs out, and I try and make sure the big piles of stuff are gone before that comes out, right? So I think that this can take a lot of energy from the team. And then the other thing, it can leave management feeling like they're painting the bridge, right? You get done with one end, you got to start over and go back the other way. And that can be very frustrating for them, right? We're always upgrading. Why are we spending so much of our budget on this? The last thing is that this has a high tendency to get interrupted. You get about a third of the way through the upgrade, and it sits off in some branch somewhere and rots while you jump onto other more urgent tasks. And maybe you get back to it, maybe you don't, and by the time you get back to it, maybe you remember what you're doing, and maybe you don't. So that can be a real drawback to this approach. Typically, when we're doing upgrades, we try and take the iterative chunks approach, which is doing each step to completion. We saw the list of steps that I would recommended for one app specifically earlier, and we'll talk a little more about the steps in detail. And then committing those and trying to get them into the main line of the code, right? Preferably deployed and make that the production code, if at all possible. Not every step can be then sent to production. Sometimes you have to accomplish a couple steps in order to get something that's really deployable, but getting them merged in and getting them part of the main line of development. And this is especially important if you have a team that's actively building features while someone's trying to do an upgrade. One of the things, because we're kind of outside consultants on projects, we get brought in just to do the upgrade. So the dev team's continuing their forward progress, we do the upgrade and we're trying to get it merged in. And that's great as long as the communication's good, because it doesn't interrupt their flow, but it still gets the upgrade done. And it means that we have to be constantly pulling their changes in, because they're essentially moving the target while we're trying to upgrade it. It does mean that you want to either track or upgrade as new code comes in. So you want to merge often while you're doing this. And essentially it's the halt the world process in miniature, right? We're going to do the halt the world to merge stuff in 5 or 6 times instead of one big time. So I wanted to have a little discussion. Who amongst you have done application upgrades in the past, and what kind of approaches have you taken?
This is my first time to Samvera, so we were on Sophia before,
Mm-hmm.
and then we kept upgrading for a new version, mainly because for every users you have a release log.
Yep.
And we really found out that doing that way kind of decreases the time if there's a major upgrade. So I'm taking the same approach for Samvera, but then I think personally I'm more because there's so much to understand and it's a piece and which is quite different to what Sophia was.
I completely agree, and I think that we'll take a few minutes and we'll look at that release log and talk about that, because it's a big part of what makes Hyrax different.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a very, very good point. I appreciate that. But so when you were doing that, those upgrades, were there other folks working on features and stuff while you were doing that, or were they small enough that they could be merged in a day or two?
I'm saying developer,
Okay.
but then going further, we'll have more developers. Is my question. One of the things that I find difficult is now that I'm way behind what version upgrades and so far. How am I going to do a complete upgrade to what it is? Because there is so much of information in every release log that you wouldn't necessarily get between the gen versions. So you really have to upgrade it to get to one.
Yeah. I'm gonna talk about that next. That's the next big topic for sure, because it is a big, hard decision, and there are a couple basic approaches. Anybody else like tackle upgrades? No? You guys get to release your code and then move on? Man.
Well, we have stuff going back to like worthwhile, pre-worthwhile, piece together hydrogen and stuff.
Mhm.
So we're kind of doing the halt the world, trying to get everything up to like a kind of a baseline, but not just a baseline, but with one code base that can then be branched out of and create specialties.
Mhm.
So we're kind of sort of doing iterative chunk versus and halt the world and trying not to move forward until we're at everything.
Got it. So you're trying to bring everybody sort of into line. Is that, I would assume that's pretty tricky.
Yeah, especially since we've borrowed things from the community along the way. So like we took Plum, the paged concern type application, and now we're trying to, so that community is going on to a Valkyrie-based route right now, and so we're still kind of dedicated, I think, to the Hyrax on Fedora route right now. So we're trying to pull the Plum abilities into Hyrax current with all the different models and everything. So, and then we have other little one-off things that have kind of been hanging out there that never really got fully productionized, which is a nice bonus.
If it's not live, then you can do
Yeah.
whatever you want with it. That's fair. Do you have like multiple developers working on that project?
At least 3, 4. Yeah, at least 3.
Yeah.
He's hiding.
significant part of the brain trust is here in the room right now. Alright, that's cool. Yeah, I think that especially when you have a lot of disparate stuff, trying to align it all, I see a lot of value in that. The hard part is sort of, really it's a management struggle of like holding back the floodgates of all the things while you get it straight around and making sure that it doesn't stretch on into infinity. Because we can, I don't know, for me as a developer, I can spend an almost infinite amount of time like polishing something if left to my own devices and not demand it to ship. So. Anybody else? Sure. Let's talk about approaches. So this dance can be danced a couple different ways, and we're going to talk about pros and cons of those. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about some things that don't work so well, in my experience. This doesn't mean you can't do some of those things. It just means that I think that there's dragons there. So let's talk about step-by-step. The step-by-step approach is to incrementally bump the major versions of the gems, or minor versions. So for example, we might go from Rails 5.1.1 to 5.1.2 to 5.1.3 and to try and keep up. And during active development, that can be really attractive. But once things are shipped in production, if you're on some sort of maintenance crew, that's much harder to do. And the production churn is much harder. The other thing that happens is when you go to major version changes and there's bigger leaps, you tend to stop and get halted at one. And then once that happens, you've lost that momentum, and getting back on it gets really tricky. When we upgrade gems, we want to pick, like we change a gem version and do bundle update for that gem. So if I'm going to up my Hyrax version, I'm going to change the Hyrax version that's specified in my gem file and bundle update Hyrax. I do not just type bundle update and then walk away from my computer for an hour while it figures out all the gems it wants to upgrade. I do not think that that works successfully most of the time. Really, really small jumps, you can kind of get away with it, but inevitably things change that you don't recognize are changed and that you don't know to then go verify or have worked. So it seems really easy to ship bugs this way. And then typically I'd look at the dependency issues and resolve them, adding more gems to my list of bundle update until I get one that resolves. So bundle update Hyrax is going to tell me I need to update my Rails version. So then I update my Rails version. When I do that, then I have 4 or 5 gems that I need to update. And so the thing about this is in the end, we get a list of the gems that we did update, right? We get this sort of hands-on knowledge of what's resolved, and that we only updated the stuff we needed to. We didn't just update sort of willy-nilly all of the things. And so the big advantage there is you're not making more work for yourself in this upgrade than you have to. And I think that's really important. Scope creep in upgrades is incredibly common, right? A really super common case is saying, well, we're going to upgrade this app from this version to this version, and we're going to change these 3 features at the same time. And I would much rather do the upgrade, ship the upgrade, and then do the feature 1, and then do feature, ship that, and then do feature 2, and then ship that, and then do feature 3, and ship that. And I know it's tempting. I know it's tempting to say, well, while we're here, we'll refactor all these other things. But the more we can split that up, the more successful I think we can be. And then there's a really good upgrading Ruby on Rails guide that I recommend. They actually do, by the way, say update all your gems, just bundle update and then go from there. But they do typically have really good incremental steps, sort of like your release notes from Hyrax, to help you go up. And I want to look at the Sophia and Hyrax release notes for a second as part of this. So if we click on releases, we can see pretty clear, detailed updates on what's happened. And we can tell just by the length of the updates how big some of these releases are. So a good example of this is Sophia 7.2 to Sophia 7.3. Is a big upgrade. A lot changes. But I really, really respect the team for the way that they handle this. They do a really good job of keeping track of what things change it and helping you understand them. I think there's a good argument to be made that if this is the release notes and all of the steps that you have to do, that this was probably not 7.2 to 7.3, it probably was 7.2 to 8.0, right? But fundamentally, knowing these are the things that we have to change, understanding that there's rig tasks for the migration is really great. This one's nice. Reindex everything as part of this upgrade, which totally works awesome in development. Can be a little time consuming if you have a live, 100,000, 200,000 data set. It's several terabytes of data. Right? That's not going to just happen. And in fact, I know from experience that in Sophia 7.3, that if you have collections that have many, many works in them, because of the direction of the relationship, it's never going to complete. Because when you load a collection, it has to load all of its works, which is not right. So if we come up a little higher, right, here's one that's a little more straightforward. The release notes for this one are just bundle update Sophia, and this release updates to Rails 5, right? So this little one line here you got to watch for, because that says you're doing a Rails 4 to Rails 5 upgrade, and that means you can go do all the steps for that as part of this, right? So it looks really small, it's a little deceptive. We pop on over to Hyrax, we get the same kind of concepts. Again, we want to go to releases. This one's a nice straightforward one. Provisional IIF3 code. Better German translations, right? And we would much prefer, I think, as a community to see lots of these small releases, even though it means that when you're behind, you have to go through the steps for each one incrementally, right? That step-by-step approach, you bump it, you get it done, you move to the next one. It can be done, and it can be plausible, to go from, let's say like 2.1 to 2.4 now? 2.3.3, by doing the upgrade once, the bundle update Hyrax one time, but then going through and following each of the steps incrementally. That can work. There are a few cases of updates that'll showstop that and prevent it from working. Like if they put in a rake task to help you with the migration and then they remove that rake task by cleaning it up later, right? So you may find some places where you stop, but that can be a worthwhile approach and may save you some time. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with doing that and then going back and saying, okay, I made it all the way to 2.2.1 and the upgrade steps on 2.2.1 aren't working, so now I'll go drop my gym version back down again and then move forward from there, right? Like you can do that and sort of cheat the system a little bit, but you are going step by step in this approach. So Rails has an app update. And what that's going to do is it's going to look at your config files and help you update them to the latest versions. So it'll tell you when they change from, like the Rails web console used to be whitelist attributes and now is whitelist IP addresses or something like that. All right, so it helps you find those things in your config files. And this is sort of a quasi-automated way of doing the equivalent of making a brand new Rails app and then copying all the configs over again and seeing what the diff is. Again, looking at the release notes from Hyrax, like I said, I really respect the work the community does to maintain those. One thing that I've noticed when I'm doing this is it's really super important for me to keep track of which things are data changes because I have to run those in production. Right? And then when we looked at that reindex everything, you run that on your local machine, you deploy to production, and production is down, is empty until you finish the reindex. Right? So that's potentially problematic. And I would argue the only way to do a large set of collections there is to spin up a separate Solr to get the new production server running have it churn through and create its new index in a separate place, and then do a switch, right? Because if it's going to take 3 or 4 days to run the reindex, or a week, right? We're not going to do that live. And someone's going to notice. And if no one notices, then you start questioning why you're doing what you're doing. It's not a good run. Another thing that the community has that is excellent is the samvera.github.io usability plan. And we've been using that as a test plan a lot. There's some amazing work that's gone into building that. I took some apprentices about 6 months ago and we went through and took a bunch of screenshots that described all the steps. And so those will almost always be wrong because they get out of date over time, but it gives you an idea of what it's supposed to look like, which I think is super useful. But just the written requirements spec there is really, really great. And we've actually taken that and forked it and customized it for certain repositories and essentially used that to build our QA test plan. I started my career doing software validation for medical device software. So FDA regulated, I've taken a cart full of paper down to document control that all have my signature all over it. And so I sometimes fall back into that. Automated testing is amazing, but someone has to look at the stuff and make sure it's actually working. And whether that's a dev task in your organization, sort of a client task, or some mixture of both, I think that having a plan can make it a lot more repeatable. And again, in the step-by-step approach, often it's helpful to deal with the model layer first. Right? Let's get our models working properly, get our data access proper, and then move on to controllers and routes. And controllers and routes and views sort of have to come as a package because they generally don't do a whole heck of a lot on their own. Any questions about that? So I thought it would be really useful to walk through the exercise of actually upgrading the app that we have. But I'm interested in a show of hands, how many people would like to do that and how many people would like to skip it? We're going to be done early if we skip it. You'd like to do it? Okay. So maybe we can pair up in groups of 2 or 3 for it? Does that work? Can you guys organize that? Remind me how to get up. Alright, let's do it. Snake there.
Roll stuff. So close to your ear.
So it'll, yeah, because it'll fetch Hyrax.
Yeah, so I changed the failure result.
Rain tonight.
Yeah. It's, I think I was getting 500 KB. Best. Which when you do Docker stuff is, yeah. Well, there's also all the timeouts.
Do we want to do that one first?
Currently pulled down.
Would it go out and grab the latest
Yeah, we don't
version?
have
No, so this one still says it's using the same Hyrax 2.0.2.
Yeah, well, let's run it.
And if I look at my diff here, I see it updated action path, that's all Rails dependencies.
I guess trying to do with React.
Just tasks.
That's Rails dependencies, that's Rails dependencies.
This is the same thing where it's bundled. It's like, you can do
Yeah, so
bundle,
for
it's like, and exclude
For task, you keep that task.
So even if I go back and look,
With the
it
JavaScript.
says
now,
it downloaded all this. I don't have
it's
it. This year doesn't go back now.
That's
Yeah.
when you connect it to sudo, you can do sudo bang bang.
When yours starts, just say that.
Alright, so we got some experience playing with upgrading a gem file and what it looks like when we upgrade an app. What was the result of our experiment? Did it upgrade everything again? They're still working now. That's alright. What did we find out?
Well, we're about to find out right now.
Okay. We're curious to find out the conclusion. This process, it doesn't matter if you're doing it 6 months from now or a year from now or 5 years from now, it's probably going to stay relatively the same. That's assuming anyone's still doing Rails in 5 years. Lord knows I'm not willing to make any kind of predictions about that. So let's talk about the two-step. So the two-step approach is essentially the same fundamental plan as our one-step approach was, except that we tackle the specs first. So this is a place where we actually might increase our spec coverage or upgrade the specs to new versions of our spec, or like really tackle the tests as a discrete unit that gets hopefully merged back into the running live code before we tackle doing any upgrade work, right? So we just handle the tests first. And a lot of that is if you have an app that doesn't have a lot of test coverage, that can build your confidence in your success. And also if your tests are gonna break, it's a good merge spot. And especially for small version jumps, this is a great little addendum to just make sure our tests are doing the right thing before we get down the road too far. So what I'm calling here the Riri is the idea of creating a clean new Rails app and then moving the components over one at a time. So we talked about this when we talked about our sample plan. With that app, the gap was so big, right? 2.4 to 5.1, we're talking about 7 or 8 years of evolution of Rails. That moving the models over one at a time, making the specs pass into a clean app can be really useful. The time it takes to do this is relatively consistent, right? So if you're doing it a tiny jump and you do this method, it takes about the same amount of time to do a much bigger jump, right? It's a little more like time-wise consistent for each slice. But for smaller jumps, like this is sort of our method of, it's not our last resort, but it should be down the list of things we decide to try, right? You should only try and do what you need to because it's time consuming, right? You're touching every single line of code no matter what when you do this. The steps for that are, again, copying the specs over and getting them all running and failing. And then getting any configs and initializers, any dependencies, updating just the models and bringing those over. Any lib stuff or external dependencies, bringing that stuff in place. Finally, copying over any assets, since our controllers and views won't be super awesome without their supporting style sheets. And lastly, bringing the controllers and views and routes over and modifying them as needed to get them running. Right. So, good examples of this is we have a Sophia 7.3 application that we're upgrading to the latest Hyrax, and we decided to take this approach with that application. And the big reason we did that was actually a data reason. So in Sophia 7.3, the underlying version of Hydra works that it uses, collection have the ideas of all the works that are in them. So the collection object, when you add a work to the collection, it writes the ID to the collection, which is fine if you have small collections and works can be in many collections. But if you have large collections, it doesn't work at all. It bogs down because every time you open the collection, you have to load all of the works that are a part of that collection. And we have an app that has probably 20,000 works in a single collection, and so we can't even convince Fedora to give us that collection anymore. It times out basically every time. And so that's a problem, right? And is a huge issue. And that app is actively adjusting more data as we speak, and so that problem keeps getting worse. However, the ingestion for that app is pretty quick. It's probably going to take us about a week to re-ingest the data once we do the flip. So what we've decided to do essentially is we'll bring up a second production server after like porting all of the code to a brand new clean code base, and then we'll run the ingestion again from the beginning and spin the bandwidth to bring it all back up, and then switch over which one is the production server instead of trying to like go through that collections. And part of the problem is in order to flip the collections and work IDs around, you have to load all the collections, which is the part that isn't working. So we're just kind of digging our way out of it that way. And one of the things that happens a lot in Hyrax applications and Samvera applications as a whole is you get to a place where the stuff in Solar is still accessible, but Fedora is not working underneath it. And that's a huge problem. Because Solar is not meant to be your source of record, right? It's meant to be the part that's just a cache of search index data. It's not meant to be the place that's the actual data store. And so you can't super trust that everything is in it. And so it's really a little tricky there. But again, I really reserve this for large jumps. I feel like we talked about that. All right, some of the things that have been struggles for us in doing upgrades. So the biggest thing about an upgrade is to focus just on the upgrade. Again, the more feature changes you try and add as part of your upgrade, the harder and longer it takes. And the longer you're in that upgrade pipeline, the more risk there is to it. There's distraction risk, there's this sort of kind of getting lost on polishing the thing forever risk, and there's lost momentum, right? Like you're not delivering story points to the business while you're doing the upgrade. The point of the upgrade, changing the code underneath the hood, is that you end up back in the place you are right now as far as the business is concerned. And when I say the business, I mean management, the consumers of your product, whatever your client's concept is. So I really advise trying to do the smallest thing at a time. If you need to bring in a temporary gem to, for example, there's a gem that brings back the old parameter security and disabled strong params, right? Do your upgrade with that turned off, with that extra gem in there, and then go back as a separate step and implement strong params, if at all possible, right? Like by doing those things piecemeal and getting to a stable place as often as possible, you'll be much more likely to successfully ship something. Bundle update without any arguments is problematic. What did we find out, gentlemen? Did the Rails update, bundle update Rails do the wrong thing?
Well,
the right thing?
it did, but I think we hit another problem.
Okay.
But I think it did do what
It
you
did
had
what we
said.
expected
Yeah.
it to do. Okay.
But there's another problem.
There's always another problem. That's the point of this process. And the thing about this process is you go into it knowing you're gonna type bundle update something probably 10, 15 times, right? You're gonna spend a bunch of time going through controllers that will load and changing before underscore filter to before underscore action. And like little semantic things. It's just chipping away at it. And so you have to sort of re-gauge your success. That's part of the benefit of the smaller pieces, is you can feel successful by accomplishing one of the small pieces. Otherwise the slog